And thank you for joining us today. I am Carlos Bosques and the CEO at FASI. The recent FDA approval of Xolair for the treatment of food allergies has sparked a great excitement within the FASI network, the medical community, and among patients and parents of families. This approval marks a crucial milestone in addressing the challenges posed by food allergies and instills optimism for a safer and more secure futures for those affected. At FASI, we're not only eager for the substantial benefits that Xolair will bring to the food allergy community, but we also anticipate that this approval will catalyze the development of additional and improved therapeutic options for everyone. FASI remains committed to finding a cure to food allergies, and with Xolair's approval and our end-to-end research capabilities, we feel more than ever one step closer to a cure. With this approval, we felt it was only appropriate to set up a meeting and sit down with our FASI community to provide better understanding of the history of Xolair, how it works, and the recent clinical trials that led to the approval of Xolair for the treatment of food allergies. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Del Umetsu to discuss Xolair's recent approval. Del is a key contributor to the development of Xolair, and he spent about 30 years. He has spent over 30 years in academic medicine, and a great part of that has been working with Xolair from its early days as a professor at Stanford University, then working as a professor at Harvard, and subsequently serving as a principal medical director and global development lead for Xolair at Genentech. We're also honored to have Del as one of our FASI's scientific advisor, and it is really an honor to have the opportunity to sit with Del today and communicate and help our community learn more about Xolair and the recent trial. Before we start the discussion, I just want to remind everyone that we will take questions from the Q&A box at the end. So please feel free to submit your questions and we'll make sure we address the questions. We have about 45 minutes, but we can stay for an hour. And if we cannot answer all the questions, we will try to get back to people via email afterwards. So Del, great to see you again. It is really an honor to have you here. It's always a pleasure to learn from you. So we have about 200 people on the line today, Del. So I think, and we've been receiving a lot of questions in anticipation of your talk. So if you can help our audience, if you can provide our audience with an overview of your background and your history of how you got involved with Xolair, and provide some historical perspective and insight of Xolair, I think that will be a great place to start.
So good afternoon, and thanks very much for the invite. I'm very excited to be here. With regard to my background, as you mentioned, I had the privilege of working in academic medicine for more than 30 years. I was a tenured professor of pediatrics at Stanford and then at Harvard Medical School. I loved being a professor since I got to treat patients, teach students, including undergrads, graduate students, postdocs, residents, and fellows, and also run a research lab that was primarily NIH funded. But in the clinic, it became clear to me that food allergy was a major problem with few treatments. And so we started doing clinical studies with Xolair about 20 years ago, when I was at Stanford, and then we continued this when I went to Harvard. And through studying Xolair over a period of 10 years, I got to know Genentech, which is a company that makes Xolair. And I eventually joined Genentech in 2013 to see if I could help get Xolair approved by the FDA for food allergy. I'm retired now, but I still consult with a few biotech companies. I can talk a little bit about the history of Xolair. As you mentioned, Carlos, it was approved for asthma back in 2003. That was 2 decades ago. And it was the first biologic, that is a monoclonal antibody, approved for asthma. And it remained the only biologic for asthma for more than 10 years. But today, as you know, there are another 5 additional biologics approved for asthma, and that's all been done in the last 10 years. So Xolair was really the first for asthma. It was the first for another indication for chronic idiopathic urticaria. And now it's the first biologic approved for food allergy. So it actually has a pretty good track record.
That is great, Dale. And I think it's commendable of you actually jumping from academia to continue the path and trying to get this forward in the industry with Genentech and get it approved to now make it available to people and for food allergies. Dale, it would be good probably for our audience to better understand what is Xolair and how does it work. For us, I know we talk about it all the time, but I think for our audience, the very diverse background that we have, if you can share a little bit more about what is it and how does it work.
Sure. And I do have a slide for this, so let me share my screen. Okay, let me go to view. Okay, so here this represents Xolair. It's this Y because it's a monoclonal antibody produced by recombinant DNA methods. It binds to free IgE, which is represented by this bent Y. And IgE, as all of you know, is the antibody that's responsible for IgE-mediated allergy. And so Xolair neutralizes IgE. It prevents it from binding to the mast cells, and thereby it prevents mast cell activation, which would occur in the presence of allergen. And this mast cell activation, if it were to occur, releases a host of mediators such as histamine, which, as you all know, cause allergic reactions. So Xolair prevents this activation of mast cells and leaves the mast cell in this inactive state. So I can stop sharing here.
Thank you. That is great.
And so just let me finish that. Because Xolair is extremely effective in preventing mast cell activation, it's very effective in suppressing allergy, in particular food allergy.
Thank you, Dale. You talked about the fact Xolair has been approved since 2003 in asthma, so there's a great record of implementation or use of Xolair in humans. Can you talk a little bit about the safety, long-term safety, and the studies that have been done? I know I've looked at some of the trials, and I've been actually very impressed with the history in the clinic with Xolair and other indications. If you can actually talk a little bit more about that and how it transitioned from that to food allergies, I think it'll be very useful.
Sure. I'm very familiar with the history, and it was indeed approved 2 decades ago for asthma, 2003. And back then, people really didn't appreciate the role of biologics in medicine and in allergy. So in 2003, in the early 2000s, it really did not actually get much use for asthma, as perhaps it should have. But even back in the early 2000s, I was thinking that Xolair, based on this mechanism of action, might actually be very effective for food allergy. This is back in the early 2000s. And so Kari Nadeau and I, working at Stanford back then, started working with Xolair, and this continued when I moved to Harvard. And around this time in the early 2000s, there were actually many promising studies with oral immunotherapy showing that it was actually very effective. But as you all know, allergic reactions are very, very common with oral immunotherapy. And this really hinders the use of oral immunotherapy. So Kari and I proposed back then that we could maybe use Xolair to reduce these allergic reactions and make OIT safer. Now, although it may sound moot now, it sounds very easy to think that it will work. But back then, we met with a lot of skepticism, lots of doubters, and in fact, very few thought it would work. And in fact, we couldn't get our studies funded. Nevertheless, we pursued this idea, and Kari and I, along with Linda Schneider in Boston, since I was there at that time, and this was well before I moved to Genentech, we found, surprisingly, that Xolair was incredibly effective in facilitating oral immunotherapy. It made it safer, made it faster, and it worked even in the worst milk and peanut allergic individuals that we could find. It was really, truly astonishing. But I realized early on that although Xolair was very effective for food allergy, it would not help large numbers of patients unless medical insurance paid for it, because it's a biologic, it's very expensive. And this would only happen if Xolair was approved for food allergy by the FDA. So I thought early on that we needed to get FDA approval for Xolair. And I thought the best way was to get Genentech involved. So as I mentioned, I'd gotten to know Genentech over a 10-year period while in academic medicine. I was a consultant for Genentech, and so I knew a number of people there. And so eventually I actually joined Genentech in 2013 to work on this dream of getting Xolair approved by the FDA for food allergy. And as you mentioned, I became principal medical director and global development lead for Xolair. But it was an interesting transition. Clearly, I didn't know much about drug development and working in the pharmaceutical industry. But I also found that there was actually very little enthusiasm for developing Xolair for food allergy in upper management. And this was in part because Xolair was an old drug by then. It was 10 years on the market. Its patent was expiring. And Genentech, being a great company, had many other newer drugs and wanted to move on with these other newer drugs, which to them were much more exciting. And this is also true at Novartis, which is Genentech's partner in marketing Xolair. They also had newer drugs. In fact, they had a second generation Xolair. You may have heard of legalizumab. And so the business plan to pursue Xolair just did not make any sense to Genentech or Novartis. Now, fortunately, I wasn't out of a job at that point. We had actually a number of work streams to keep us busy. So data from a number of large 10-year safety studies were coming in around this time. I was lucky enough to be there when they were completed. So one study done over 10 years showed that there was really no increase in the risk of malignancy with Xolair use. There were some hints that that might be a problem, but this 10-year study showed that there was really no increase in the risk of malignancy, although you may still see that in the package insert and as one of the warnings. But the data shows that it is quite safe with regard to malignancy. Another study showed that the risk of anaphylaxis was very low and easily managed. And again, there's still now a black box warning that was from 2003. But again, the studies show that it's rare and it also is easily managed. And a third study, also a 10-year study, showed that using Xolair was safe for even in pregnant women. And so this is really important for pediatrics, showing that exposure to infants was safe. And so this implied perhaps that Xolair was also very safe in young children. So we'd use this argument with upper management that Xolair was safe, and I and a few others at Genentech pushed to go to the FDA to approve Xolair for some other indications. And first, we worked on pediatric asthma. And the FDA had been very concerned about using Xolair in young children, especially because of the malignancy issue, was the first biologic in asthma. But we focused on this great unmet medical need in pediatric asthma, which I was very familiar with, and that Xolair was in fact very effective and safe. And so we submitted this package to the FDA, and surprisingly, the FDA agreed, and they approved Xolair for young children with asthma. And this was a great surprise to many folks at Genentech. And we then looked at a liquid formulation in a prefilled syringe, which would make it much easier to administer and less painful for patients to receive Xolair compared to the dried powdered version, which was on the market back then. A number of people at Genentech told me it was a waste of time to pursue this because a previous study done at Genentech showed that the liquid version, this prefilled syringe version, was really not as effective. But scientifically, I just couldn't understand this. I mean, it's the same monoclonal antibody. One's in a liquid form, the other's in a powdered form. So I, being a scientist, looked very closely at the primary data, and we reanalyzed it. And it appeared that there was some misunderstanding in the data. And in the reanalysis, we showed that the liquid formulation was actually as effective as the powdered form. And we met with the FDA about this, and this time the FDA agreed and actually approved the liquid formulation back then in a prefilled syringe, which again was a big surprise to many people at Genentech. So these successes really energized our team. Before this, everyone was really down on Xolair, but these successes really turned things around. Even management started to get excited about Xolair, and the sales of Xolair actually started to increase, which was very unusual for a 10-year-old product. Mm-hmm. And so we took this momentum and we actually tried to move forward with food allergy at Genentech. But the next step was getting the FDA on board. This was another uphill, and this was actually a very big challenge. And our initial interaction with the FDA back in 2015 focused on Xolair with oral immunotherapy as a combination. And this really did not go well. We tried again a year later, and it also did not go well. The FDA was just not interested in Xolair plus food allergy. And they said if you wanted to pursue this, you would have this complicated path forward for approval with Xolair and OIT. And this was way too complicated for any one of us to pursue. So we basically hit a dead end. We were very disappointed. But I'd learned a lot from these FDA interactions. They did agree that a double-blind food challenge could be used as an endpoint for food allergy studies. And this was a breakthrough. And a lot of this, of course, was pioneered by Aimmune, where they got Palforzia approved. But we did go back to the drawing boards. We kept what the FDA told us. But a lot of people at Genentech told me that I should stop pursuing this. I was beating a dead horse, but I knew we had a great product, so I was very persistent.
And it is so good to hear about those long-term clinical studies and safety studies that were done in asthma, because it really, especially for the population that we are dealing with in food allergies, right? That are kids and adults that are otherwise healthy. I think that's a key characteristic of the product that is going to be very crucial. So they'll transitioning from there to now the clinical study that was done in food allergies to actually approve Xolair for the treatment of food allergies. Can you talk to our audience a little more about, that study, the frequency of dosing, the efficacy, the durability, response rates. There's a lot in that study, and I've been very excited reading the study and all of that. But if you can provide a little bit more
Sure.
information, the audience would be great.
The study that was set up, the phase 3 study, was done with all of these prior interactions with the FDA in mind. So we decided to go with Xolair monotherapy, that is, Xolair without the oral immunotherapy. And this was an approach that the FDA was much more interested in. And it also, though, made us able to work with basically any food, not with a single food with OIT, but pretty much any food. And so they agreed to set up a phase 3 study, which was done in collaboration with the NIH starting back in 2018. And as you may know, the study was led by Sharon Shinthraja at Stanford and Robert Wood at Johns Hopkins. And the results of the study were just published 2 weeks ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. And of course, that's the basis for the FDA approval of Xolair for food allergy. So the study was to treat approximately 180 food allergic patients aged 1 to 55 years of age. They were treated with 16 weeks of Xolair. And at the end, they were subjected to the double-blind food challenge. And what the results showed is that 2/3 of the treated patients tolerated 600 milligrams of peanut, and with a cumulative dose of 1,000 milligrams. And about a half of the patients tolerated the 2,000 milligram dose, and that's 4,000 milligrams cumulative. In contrast, only about 7% of the placebo-treated patients passed the 600 milligram dose. And the results were also similar for 6 other foods. So 7 total foods were studied, and the results, though, were very similar for egg, milk, cashew, wheat, walnut, and hazelnut. And so overall, Xolair was highly effective, increasing the reaction threshold for peanut and these 6 other foods. So based on that study, the FDA approved Xolair in February, so several weeks ago, in February. I actually have a slide for that, which I want to show that will go over a couple of the details. So let me share that. Okay, let me go to. Okay, so Xolair is now indicated for IgE-mediated food allergy in adult and pediatric patients aged 1 year and older for the reduction of allergic reactions, including anaphylaxis. So this is an incredible deal because it basically is virtually everybody with food allergy, and it's virtually any food. So this is an amazing result, and it's all based on that study because the study enrolled kids from 1 year and older. I do have to mention that this is to be used in conjunction with food allergen avoidance. Now, Xolair is an injection therapy. It is administered subcutaneously, and the dose is 75 milligrams to 600 milligrams every 2 or 4 weeks. And this is the dose is determined by body weight and serum total IgE levels. Up to the highest IgE, total serum IgE level can be 1,850. So let me just stop sharing.
Go ahead. Sorry. No.
So Actually, I should point out that the FDA also approved Xolair as an auto injector. Actually, I did have another slide for that. So sorry, let me go back. Share this. There we go. So the auto injector is really basically like an EpiPen. It's basically the same shape, and you use it pretty much in the same way. You just press onto the thigh or skin, and it automatically injects, just like an EpiPen. And there are 3 different syringes. There's a 75 milligram injector, a 150 milligram injector, and a 300 milligram injector. Now, unfortunately, this auto injector is approved only for use in patients 12 and above. So, but it is approved for self-administration at home for selected patients. So this auto injector should make the administration of Xolair so much easier. Now, you may be asking, so what about the 1 to 12-year-old kids? And well, you can still use this pre-filled syringe. So this was approved a while ago, but it's still available for the kids. It does come in the 3 doses as the auto injector: 75, 150, and 300. And so this does have a needle, but it's still available for use in these younger kids. Okay, now I can stop sharing again.
That is great, Dale. It's so good and so convenient to have that, especially going from a powder to a liquid formulation to an auto injector that can be administered at home would make a big difference for the community. Dale, you mentioned briefly the original efforts in trying Xolair in combination with OIT. What are your thoughts about that, about Xolair in combination with OIT? I know you had some experiences with that. Can you share a little bit more about your thoughts on that?
Sure. I do want to say that the FDA approval for Xolair is limited to monotherapy. Okay, so Xolair in combination with OIT then would be off-label, in that itself is not endorsed by the FDA. They did not see the data for those kinds of studies. And I also don't think that Genentech is looking forward to pursuing that, and in part because the pathway for approval, as I mentioned earlier, is much more complicated. You'd have to also get approval for the food, and so that makes it much more difficult. But that said, we and others have shown that in experimental settings, Xolair in combination with OIT is quite effective. It's very effective. Xolair monotherapy is not disease modifying, as far as we know, but OIT can be disease modifying. And so in combination, it could be disease modifying. And together with Xolair, OIT is made safer, it's made faster. You can get to much higher maintenance doses. You can stop the Xolair after you reach maintenance dose. And so there's many possibilities for using Xolair with OIT. I must say, though, that more work needs to be done in defining the best protocol for doing OIT with Xolair. And perhaps professional societies can provide some guidelines on how this might be done in the future. But again, it's not FDA approved for combination therapy.
Thank you. Thank you, Dale. Great to clarify that. You've talked about a lot of great things about Xolair, and everyone is excited. You know this product for a long time. Can you talk about some of the limitations of Xolair as well? That would be very helpful.
Sure. Um, well, I think the main issue with Xolair is that it's an injection. Okay, it's not a pill, so you have to tolerate an injection, and it can be every 2 or every 4 weeks. I should point out that the technology today with the auto injector, with the pre-filled syringe, the needles are extremely tiny. And so that surprisingly, it doesn't hurt as much as you might think. So that's one thing I just want to point out. The second limitation is that part of this being a biologic is that it is expensive. And that's, of course, why we had to get it approved by the FDA in order for hopefully insurance companies to cover hopefully the vast majority of the cost. A third limitation is that although it's a great drug, it's a great medication, it's not a cure. So in order to benefit from it, you have to continue to use it on a monthly or twice a month basis. And one could say that there are safety concerns. It has a black box warning for anaphylaxis. But as I mentioned, this is rare and it's fairly easily managed.
Thank you, Dale. I think with that, you've already answered like 5 different questions I've been getting in the Q&A, so that this is very helpful. What is next, Dale, in thinking about beyond Xolair? What else do you think it's needed for the food allergy community in the future? Now that we have Xolair, what else is needed for this community?
So as I mentioned, Xolair is not a cure. I think that we do want to continue to look into potential cures for food allergy. Xolair has to be used continuously, injected, and it actually, the studies have shown that it may not work well in maybe 10 or 20% of patients for reasons we don't understand. So that also needs to be investigated. And for those who may not benefit from Xolair, we need to think about other treatments. And so there's, I think, a lot of space for new treatments for food allergy. And I think as we better understand the underlying science of food allergy, as FOSSI is really looking to do, we can develop new and better treatments for food allergy and perhaps cure it.
We're very excited to try to push the limits on that. Absolutely. Very, very active in that area. Dale, I think the last question I'll ask, and then we'll move to Q&A. I have a lot of questions that people have been submitting. How do you think Xolair, it was just approved? How do you think it would at least initially, will be used? And do you have any recommendations for parents and patients of food allergies with respect to the use of Xolair?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's been only a few weeks since it's been approved. I do know it is being prescribed already. I'm not sure if the auto injector is quite yet available, but I understand that it will be available very soon. The prefilled syringe, of course, is on the market. And it would be interesting to hear about how insurance companies are going to deal with this. So far, I haven't heard of any problems, but the indication, as I mentioned, is very broad. So almost any patient is eligible for receiving Xolair. And I do think that Xolair is a great product and that many patients with food allergy can benefit from it to reduce the risk of reactions occurring on accidental exposure. Perhaps one could sort of just think out loud about what are maybe the best patients to start using Xolair. And I have spoken to a couple of people about this, and we thought perhaps if you thought about an adolescent patient going off to college, where their control of access to foods, various foods, is going to be reduced significantly, right? They're going to go out to eat more. They may have risky behaviors. So I think a number of us thought perhaps a patient, an adolescent patient going off to college might deserve going on Xolair for added protection in a new environment. Another situation might be a patient who has asthma, moderate to severe asthma. It's already indicated for asthma. And if you also have food allergies, it might be that combination might help you decide on going to use Xolair as a treatment for the asthma and food allergy together. Another situation might be a patient who has multiple food allergies. So where it becomes very difficult to avoid all of these foods. And so that patient might benefit from going on Xolair because if that patient is at higher risk for getting a reaction because there's so many foods that the person may have to avoid. Now, I think that there's always questions about whether or not one should go on Xolair and start oral immunotherapy. And that's another, we discussed that a little bit, and I think that deserves a lot more thought and perhaps, as I mentioned, guidance from professional societies to sort of how to manage that in a very safe and thoughtful way.
Thank you, Dale. This is very helpful. And I think today we try to combine many of the questions that we've been receiving over the last few weeks from many people in our community. And I think your background and experience with Xolair has been just amazing and very insightful for this population. I have over 25 questions here, but I think some of them you were able to address. So, and we have some time for some questions and answers. So what I'll do is I'll go through some of them, Dale, and then we'll try to finish a little early. But I think you touch on this a little bit, but understanding the durability of the effect, one of the questions that we have is for those who would like to start in Xolair therapy, will the expectation be that the person will have to stay in Xolair for the entire life, or is there a period of time where they would be taking shots and then the protection will last forever? Can you clarify that?
Right. So as I mentioned, the benefit of Xolair is only there if you're taking it. So if you go off of it, the protection slowly goes away, and over 3 or 4 months, the blood level of Xolair will go down to zero. Fortunately, because we have 20 years of experience, we know that you can start Xolair, restart Xolair, and you can derive the same protection. And we also know that you can use it, and the protection will actually start within a few weeks. You won't get maximal protection, but the protection within a few weeks is pretty substantial. In the study that was published in the New England Journal, the investigators waited for 16 weeks of treatment before doing the double-blind food challenge. In other studies, people have waited for 8 or 9 weeks and showed that you get very good protection. And we know that the skin test reactivity actually goes away around 8 or 9 weeks. But I think even before that, there is some protection afforded by the Xolair injection. But again, maximal protection occurs from 9 to 12 weeks or so.
Perfect. Then another question that I had here is, why is the IgE level cap at 1850? Is it possible to use it in IgE with higher levels of IgE? What was the thinking behind that particular number, if you know?
Sure. So yeah, there's a whole history on that. When Xolair was approved back in 2003, the maximum serum IgE level allowed was 700. And so over the years, with more experience, that maximum level has increased from 700 to 1,500 and now 1850. The limit is in part due to the fact that Xolair has to bind to the free IgE and then neutralize it. And so you have to have enough Xolair to combine with the lots of IgE that's floating around in your blood. And so that it's possible that you'll reach a level where your serum IgE is maybe 10,000, and that you just can't get enough Xolair to neutralize all of that. And so the studies that have been done so far, they studied up to 1850. And so we know it works for that level. It probably works for higher, but that's what the indication is in the package insert. And so sometimes insurance companies will look at that in the package insert and approve patients up to that level. And it's possible that they may deny a patient whose serum IgE level is above that. So that's just the way the rules are. But 1850 is actually much higher than it was when I started working with Xolair.
And you mentioned that approximately 1/3 of the patients did not significantly benefit from Xolair. Is there anything in common with that 1/3 of patients that didn't benefit? Something that, is it just because they were not anaphylactic? Are there any thoughts on that population that did not respond?
Yes, so that's a question that does need to be investigated. I think that some of the non-responders may have gotten better, but they just didn't. They weren't able to tolerate the 600 milligrams. They just tolerated maybe 300 milligrams. It's possible that some of those patients had mechanisms of allergy that was beyond IgE. So as I mentioned, Xolair works on IgE-mediated food allergy, where IgE is the major mechanism for the reactions. Now, if there are other immune mechanisms, for example, in EOE, eosinophilic esophagitis, the mechanisms are different. And so in EOE, Xolair is not likely to be effective. So it's possible that in some of these patients, they do have IgE-mediated food allergy, but there may be other parts of their immune response that is less susceptible to Xolair. So it's possible that those are the ones that are not responding well. But again, we don't know for sure, and those patients do need to be studied a little bit more closely.
Right. Yeah, a lot of work ahead and on identifying, understand that population. Apparently in the study, it feels like out of, I think, about the 180, there were only a few that were adults. There were more children than adults. And so one of the questions is, will there be a post-marketing study for efficacy in adult population? What was the outcome of that, smaller population of adults in the study?
Right. So for those of us who've been doing food allergy studies, we know that the children are the ones that are available for these kinds of studies. And it's actually can be difficult to get adults into these kinds of studies. But the reasoning behind approval for adults is that we know that the mechanisms of food allergy are very similar in children and adults. And so this IgE-mediated mast cell degranulation is very similar in adults and in children. And so although maybe the specific foods that children get allergic to are maybe slightly different than adults. For example, shrimp and shellfish allergy is more common in adults than children. The mechanisms are the same. So I think the FDA was happy to approve it for adults based on the data of the 3 adults that they were in the study. It's just the technical word for is extrapolation, where we take the data from the children and extrapolate it to adults. And they were happy to do that and approve it for adults.
Sorry, I was muted. Del, this question may have to do with the reformulation of Xolair, but one of the question is, has the viscosity of the drug in the injector improved? When my daughter was in the triple threat study at Sinai Xolair IT, she had the liquid but it was very viscous and somewhat painful to push the drug. Has that I think that may have to do with the formulation that you spoke about. Can you tell people a little bit more about that?
Sure. It'd be interesting to know what year that was. Because the liquid formulation, I believe, was approved in 2018. And I know that the powdered form, the lyophilized version, when you reconstitute it, was much more viscous than the liquid formulation, the prefilled syringe. And consequently, you had to use a fairly good sized needle. But we know that the prefilled syringe, the needle size could be reduced because the viscosity of Xolair was reduced. I believe that the auto injector has the same liquid formulation as the prefilled syringe, and I think that the viscosity of the prefilled syringe was such that you were able to get the smaller needle size. And I think the needle size for the prefilled syringe and the auto injector are the same.
Great. Probably the last question, this has been very extensive. So it seems one question is, would you think that now under the use of Xolair, when you're getting blood work for allergies, would it mean that the allergy numbers, would it be interpreted as allergy numbers have decreased? I guess the IgE has decreased. So then hard to accurately assess if the numbers have decreased or changed in terms of an allergic response?
So I'm not sure I understand this. So are they saying that can you monitor the progress on Xolair if your allergy goes down? Is that?
I guess, yes.
So unfortunately, when you're on Xolair, you cannot measure the IgE levels. And it's both the total IgE and food-specific IgE. And the reason is that there are these small complexes of IgE and Xolair. There are about 3 IgEs sort of bound. They're small complexes, and these have been studied a lot to make sure that they weren't causing problems. Initially, it was a concern, but we know that these complexes actually float around in patients on Xolair. And initially, people thought this was not good, but it turns out that these complexes, the IgE is facing outward, and so it actually can bind allergen in the blood. And so these complexes actually form sinks for allergen. So it makes the whole Xolair more effective because it sops up not only free IgE, but it sops up free allergen that might be floating when you get exposed to it. So, and it disposes of the allergen floating around. So the complexes are there, and that makes it impossible to actually monitor the amount of IgE to foods and monitor the total IgE while you're on Xolair. So in order to measure that, you do have to stop the Xolair, maybe wait 3 or 4 months so that these complexes go away and the Xolair levels are low, and then you can measure it again. Unfortunately, that's what our experience has been.
Great. Well, I won't go to the entire 47 questions that I have here, but I think that may be an indication of the interest of people and the excitement of the community to have you share a little bit of light in the history of Xolair, how it works, and the recent trial, and hopefully the recommendations for use of Xolair. Dale, we really appreciate it. Before I close, I would just like to remind people, we always get asked of how can people get involved and in FOSSI, donate, host events, follow us in social media, and please join our webinars. There's a QR code here that can help you get quickly into FOSSI and communicating with our network. And I want to remind people, next Tuesday at noon, we have a great seminar by our colleague Noah Palm from Yale University, where we'll be discussing more about bugs and as drugs and screening microbes for host benefits. So please stay tuned and join us on our webinar. Dale, thank you so much for taking the time and continuing to teach us every day a little bit more. It is an honor to have you as a board member, as a SAB member of FOSSI, and be able to learn from you. And thank you. I think for our audience, thank you for joining a record of more than 200 people and 49 questions. So I hope this was informative to everyone.
Right. Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks. Bye-bye.